Christ. Amen. So, do you believe in miracles?
Yes.
We say that we do. All right, good answer. Thank you, Marilyn. Do some of us maybe struggle with the belief in miracles?
Yes.
Yes. Have you ever witnessed a miracle in your life?
Yes.
Yes? All right. I'd be curious. We won't do this right now, but I'd be very curious to hear what we consider to be the miracles in our lives. Perhaps some of us are thinking about something like childbirth. Perhaps some of us are thinking about stories of healing. And perhaps some of us are thinking about supernatural experiences like apparitions or ghosts or something like that. I'm not sure if I have witnessed a miracle in the same sense that we think of the biblical miracles as being miracles. I'm still pretty young, and I'm not quite sure. But surely, just because we're not sure if we've witnessed a miracle, that doesn't mean that they cannot happen. One of the most fundamental tenets of our Christian belief is the belief in miracles, and specifically in these miracles of Jesus. Now, I'm kind of a dork about these kind of things, so I love to ask questions like, how do we think these miracles happen? Is it the power of the Holy Spirit at work? Is it the power of the divine within Christ working? Is it something even more scientific than that? Or is it perhaps pointless to ask how the biblical miracles of Jesus could have happened? Does that maybe defeat the purpose of having faith in them? Are we supposed to just believe these things without questioning how they were done? Christ's miracles are one of the recurring motifs in the gospel narrative. And the most famous ones are the book of signs. This is the section in the middle of the Gospel of John, which tells about Jesus' ministry, and it describes the 7 miracles he performs. And we're going to have a little bit of a sort of Sunday school review today. We're just going to briefly go over all these miracles today. These are the 7 signs that signal Christ's divinity to all those who bear witness to them. They occur between chapter 2 and chapter 11, interspersed with other events. And so the book of signs, when we refer to it that way, it's not a contiguous book. It's not all connected, but it consists of separate passages that are brought together in a common narrative theme. That narrative is the divine power of Christ, as demonstrated through his ministry. So here's another question. Could anyone name the 7 signs of John off the top of your head? I don't know if I could, because some of them blend together. You'll know several of them. So the 7 miracles include 1, Jesus healing the royal official's son in Capernaum. And we're going to review all these in a bit of detail in a moment. 2, Jesus healing a paralytic at Bethesda. 3, Jesus feeding the 5,000, which we already talked about. 4, Jesus walking on the water, which we're all familiar with. 5, Jesus healing the blind man, which we've all heard before. 6, and this is chronologically the last one and the most impressive one, Jesus actually raising Lazarus from the dead, which foretells his own resurrection. And the 7th and final one is the one we've just read, the passage of wine being turned into water. Chronologically, that's the first of the signs. Now, some people dispute this list of 7 that I just gave you. Some would say that Christ walking on water and Christ feeding the 5,000 are part of the same miracle because they happen right next to each other. That the 7th sign is actually the resurrection itself, because surely that counts as one of the miracles of Christ. Others would include the cleansing of the temple in chapter 2, that passage which immediately follows today's passage. Others would argue the inclusion of an eighth sign, which might be the miraculous catch of fish, which we mentioned in our children's message. But apart from those small disagreements, this list of 7 signs is pretty well agreed upon. And the resurrection then would be the implied 8th or final sign, proving once and for all that Christ is the Son of God, the incarnation of God's love in the world. So you'll notice as we're going through these, several of them describe healing events. So in chapter 4, Jesus is visiting Cana in Galilee. This is the same site where he changes the water into the wine. So it's an important site in his ministry. He returns there. And there, these people know about the first miracle, the water into wine. And so when he arrives, there's the royal official whose son is sick. He hears that Jesus is there, so he goes to Christ and he begs him to come heal his son. And Christ says, and he says this in several of these passages, "You need to witness my signs and wonders in order to believe." And he tells the man his son will live and that he should go home. The man returns to find that his son has indeed been healed. And his servants say it happened at the same time that the man was speaking to Jesus. So the man believes. There's another act of healing that comes shortly after this. The next chapter, Christ goes to Jerusalem. He arrives and he's surrounded by a large number of disabled individuals. And Christ speaks to one man who has suffered in his condition for many, many years, decades. And he says, "Do you want to get well?" The man tells Jesus he cannot walk, and so he cannot be bathed or cleaned or healed. Jesus tells him, "Get up and walk." And so he does. When Jesus tells us to do something, this passage implies, we find that we can do it, despite our doubts and our fears. Jesus then, in this one, slips into the crowd so as not to draw too much attention, and he later meets that same man back at the temple, and he reminds him to live faithfully. So we have those first 2 healings, and the next 2 signs are ones we're all familiar with. Christ in chapter 6 is with a great crowd. He's looking to feed them all with bread. And Philip, who is with him, claims it'll take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for everybody who's there. Christ finds 5 loaves and 2 fishes among the crowd. He orders everyone to sit down. He says, "Sit down, everybody. Everyone will be fed." He gives thanks just as we do over communion. He distributes the loaves and the fish to the 5,000. And there is no indication in this passage about just how he does this or how he makes it work. It may not even be worth our time to try and figure out what it looks like when he's doing this. But everyone, it says, is fed by the work of Christ. And then at the end, they still have 12 full baskets of leftovers to put in the refrigerator downstairs in Fellowship Hall when they're done. And this, like all the other ones, it causes the people to say, "Surely this is a prophet. Surely this man is the Son of God." Later on, in roughly the same passage, and so this is why these 2 are sometimes disputed, he goes to join his disciples on the lake. They're out on the water in their boat. They look toward the shore. They see Jesus walking on the surface. And it terrifies them. But Christ says, "Don't be afraid. It is I." John's version doesn't have this, but Matthew's version then tells us that Peter gets out of the boat, joins Christ on the water, walks toward him until Peter becomes afraid again. Don't look down, right? Or you'll fall, just like Wile E. Coyote. And once again, Christ reaches out, grabs him, stops him from falling, and he says, "Ye of little faith." Christ wants those who bear witness to his miracles to take them as signs of his power, as reasons to believe in him. And we'll go through just the other two healings. We'll finish up real quick. Two more healings. In chapter 9, Christ is confronted by a blind man. The disciples assume, as the disciples often make assumptions, that either the man or his parents must have sinned or done something wrong, so that this man was born blind. Christ corrects them. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, God had a plan for this blind man. And as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. Christ in these words is reminding us that he is the light of the world, that his work happens under the light, both literally and metaphorically. His work is the light. He spits on the ground, he takes a bit of mud, and he places it on the man's eyes. The man goes to wash his eyes, and he finds his sight restored. And the final healing in the book of signs, as we said, is the most miraculous of all. The raising of Lazarus. Lazarus here is in Bethany, where his sisters, Mary and Martha, are taking care of him. He's sick, he's at death's door. And the sisters approach Christ, and they tell him Lazarus is sick. Christ here, instead of immediately going to him, he reassures them. He says, this sickness will not end in death. And of course, we, or they, or both, misinterpret this. The sickness will not end in death. Well, okay, that means he's not going to die. Sometime later, Christ bids his disciples to follow him to the place where Lazarus lies. For Lazarus has, in fact, died against this promise of Christ. He's been placed in a tomb by his sisters, and there's a group of people with the sisters mourning him and comforting them. Martha approaches Christ and she says, Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. And Jesus says to her, you can see how they're confused. You can see how they're upset and angry at this promise being seemingly broken. He says to her, your brother will rise again. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Martha then confesses. She says, Christ, indeed you are the Messiah. You are the Son of God come into this world. Mary goes to Christ and she says the same thing. If only you had been here, Lazarus would not have died. And Jesus says, okay, all right, let's go take a look. He goes to the tomb. But before he performs this last miracle, Jesus takes a moment to weep. He doesn't say, do not weep. He doesn't say it's not appropriate to weep over the reality of death. The weeping comes before the miracle. And after the weeping, Christ prays a prayer to God. And he orders the tomb to be opened. He shouts, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man emerges, still wrapped in cloths, to the astonishment of all who are there. Seeing this, everyone confesses that Jesus is truly the Son of God. So once again, the purpose of all these miracles, we could do a 7-part sermon series if we wanted, over 7 weeks on each of these signs. And the recurring theme of that sermon series would be that the purpose of these miracles is that we all bear witness to them and believe in him. And this raising of Lazarus, of course, foretells the raising of Christ and the story of the empty tomb, which we will revisit in the season of Easter. And the seventh sign, which we don't really need to go through, is the changing of water to wine, which we heard today. And there are other miracles described in other portions of these Gospels, but this book of signs, is the most sort of well-known and comprehensive list. We take this set of miraculous acts, healings, transformations. We bear witness to it through these holy scriptures so that we can believe in Jesus Christ, just as his earliest followers did. If we believe, we are promised, we will see the miracles that he has done. So again, thinking about miracles. Now, many of us have seen miracles in our lives. Those of us who are younger, perhaps, are not so sure. Perhaps some of us are not quite sure what constitutes a miracle or exactly how a miracle happens. Now, the Catholic Church has a formal list. They have a Wikipedia list of confirmed miracles that have been claimed as miracles by the authority of the church. We have no such list in the United Methodist Church. So we are left to discern a little more. Do we need to witness a miracle in order to believe in it? Do we need to be there in person? How do we account for these things that Christ has done? How do we account for the miracles that have happened in this world? How could we possibly hope to replicate the miracles that Christ performed? Believing in not only miracles, but in our power to bring them about in the seeming absence of Christ. That's really hard. We may have to bargain a little bit. We may have to jump through some hoops in order to wrap our 21st century minds around these ideas. Put another way, we may have to accept that the work of Jesus is as mysterious as it is miraculous. We probably wouldn't get anywhere if we just said, performing great acts of healing and nourishment is as simple as believing really hard. I don't know how much that would help us, but what we can take away from this is that with the power of God, all things are possible. Even those things which defy our logic and our abilities. We're not expected to just blindly accept the possibility of miracles. We are conditioned to be skeptical and uncertain about them, just as the disciples were. It's part of their journey. What is expected of us is not a faith that happens easily or without struggle or doubt, but a faith that must be earned through working relationship with Christ and the Holy Spirit. Thanks be to God, and amen.